السلام عليكم Sheikhna.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته أخي.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I can. How are you doing, أخي? Okay?
No. 1 second.
Is the camera angle okay, or do you want me to do it this way?
It's good.
It's fine, yeah?
1 second. Are you ready?
Yes, inshallah.
Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum, Ikhwan wa Akhwat. We are honored to welcome Ustadh Yasir bin Yousaf to Deen Court for fathers of the life of Sheikh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. We thank Ustadh Yasir for dedicating his time to share his valuable insight about this great scholar. May Allah reward him and make this gathering a source of benefit for us all. Barakallahu feekum, Sheikhna.
Okay. Can I start here?
No. Yes.
بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أما بعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته, everyone. I cannot see anyone, but inshallah ta'ala, I hope you guys can hear me. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. I'd like to begin by thanking Deen Court for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put it on the scales of good deeds on the day of judgment. يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. On the day no child, no wealth is going to benefit anyone except the person who comes with a clean and purified heart. So ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward them and to purify all of our hearts. Now this speech and what we're going to be speaking about today is the life of a man that is someone that is fascinating, to say the least. And it's fascinating from many angles. From an angle of the accomplishments of the Sheikh and how much he's accomplished in his life. From the angle of how he is on the mouth of a lot of people. He is a topic of discussion not only for the Muslims and within the realms of Islam, even outside Islam, the non-Muslims, Orientalists, they are speaking about this man. And there's countless books written about this man, either praising him or criticizing him, but they're all speaking about him. And also from the angle of how the Sheikh, he exerted a lot of effort, the effort that he put in personally. So this man is a person who amazes me. And a lot of times I read the life of the biography of the scholars, different scholars of Islam, and little do I read that really surprises me and amazes me every time, except for Sheikh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah. His life is very fascinating. So inshallah ta'ala, what we hope to do in today's lecture is give you a bit into his life and really more so derive lessons that we can take home at the end of the lecture, by which we can implement in our lives and try to get better bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So the life of scholars is important for a Muslim because as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قَصَصِهِمْ عِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. In the stories of those who came before us, there is lessons for us that we take. And so a person who's smart, he learns from the experiences of others. So we hope to learn from the experience of this great man. And also the scholars, they said, إِذَا مَرَدْنَا تَدَاوَيْنَا بِذِكْرِكُمُ وَنَتْرُكُ الذِّكْرَ أَحْيَانًا فَنَنْتَكِسُ. When a person gets demotivated sometimes, which is normal for a human being and normal for a Muslim, we need somewhat of a role model to look up to. There's no doubt that our greatest role model is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you have the perfect example, the perfect role model. But then after that, we need to take more role models, like the Sahabas and the Tabi'in, and after that, the scholars of Islam. So Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah is one of those scholars of Islam. And I'm highly confident that most of the people have heard of his name once, whether in criticism or praise of the Shaykh. So to start with, the name of the Shaykh and where he was born. The Shaykh's name is Ahmed. His father's name is Abdul Halim, and his grandfather's name is Abdul Salam. So his own name is Ahmed. His father's name is Abdul Halim, and his grandfather is Abdul Salam. And he comes from a lineage of scholars. So his father was a scholar of Islam, and his father was a man who was a lecturer and a teacher at a famous institute called Darul Hadith al-Sukariya. And his grandfather was even a greater sheikh, and his grandfather was they used to call him the Mufti of the Hanabila. He was a Mufti of the scholars of the Hanbali madhab at that time. So he was a very, very prominent sheikh. And his father, he started to write a book called Al-Muswadda fi Usul al-Fiqh, and he never finished it. The father of Ibn Taymiyyah started to work on it. He never finished it. And then came Ibn Taymiyyah himself, Ahmed, and he finished the book. So he finished the book that his grandfather had started writing. And it's a book in Usul al-Fiqh. And so he comes from a life and a lineage of scholars and people who are people of knowledge, righteous people. And from this, we learned the very first lesson of today's lecture, which is, if you are a person who's righteous, your offsprings will be righteous. And a lot of the time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He protects your lineage and your offsprings as a result of your righteous actions. And this is why in the story of Surah Al-Kahf, when we read it, there is a story of the two young orphans whose treasure was hidden under a wall. And it was broken. The wall was about to fall down. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands Khidr and Musa alayhi salam, as a result, because he was accompanying Khidr, to build that wall. And they built that wall, and this was protecting the wealth of the orphans that was behind the wall. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then says, وَكَانَ أَبُوهُمَا صَالِحًا, that their father of these two orphans was a righteous man. So we learn from this, if your father is righteous, Allah will protect your wealth, Allah will protect your children and your offsprings that come after. Which is why we see in the life in a lot of the Salaf, they would sometimes pray voluntary prayer. Some of them, they would reach up to 300, 400 rak'ah every day. And they would just pray voluntary, just nawafil. And some of them, they would look at their children and say, إِنِّي لَأَزِيدُ فِي الرَّكْعَةِ مِنْ أَجْلِكَ, I increase in my prayers to Allah for your sake. Why? So that Allah can protect you. And the scholars, they say, and as the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions in the hadith of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, Ya ghulam, inni u'allimuka kalimat. He came to a young companion, Ibn Abbas, who's also his cousin. And he said to him, I'm going to teach you a few words. Ihfadillaha yahfadka. Guard and safeguard the boundaries of Allah, and Allah will safeguard you. So as a result of your righteous actions, Allah will safeguard you, your health, your life, and your children, and your offsprings, and everything that comes after. Which is why sometimes there were scholars from the Salaf, and some of these scholars of the Salaf, they would reach a very old age. And one account was mentioned where one of the scholars, he was at the age of 70, and he was on top of his riding beast. And then he jumped from the top of his riding beast onto the floor. And it's a very high place. And at the age of 70, you are a person who's... Somebody trying to raise your hand? So at the age of 70, it's a very high place for you to jump off, a riding beast. And when he jumped off the riding beast, he landed safely. His students who were there, they got worried. And they said, Sheikh, are you okay? You've just jumped from a high place. You're hurt. You're 70, you're old. And he said a very wise statement. And he said, these jawarih, these limbs, حفظناها في الصغر. We safeguarded them from haram whilst we were young. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala safeguarded us, or safeguarded these body parts for me when I'm old. So nothing happened to me. And even one of my Sheikh Abdul al-Khadair, حفظه ta'ala, mentioned the story which is very similar. There's an old man living in Riyadh. And at that time in Riyadh, there was a lot of construction work. So there's a lot of ditching, holes that were dug on the earth in order for construction, drainage and stuff like that. And so there's an old man that he fell into it. And it was a very deep, deep hole. And he got up like nothing happened to him. And he said a similar statement that Allah protected me because I protected the rights of Allah. So the first lesson that we learned from the life of Ibn Taymiyyah, the fact that he came from a great lineage of righteous people, scholars of Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also safeguarded him and protected him. As we see even at a young age, Allah is protecting him. and Allah is putting barakah in his time and allowing him to accomplish so much. And he came from a lineage of scholars, and therefore he came out, and there's no surprise that he would come up with as a scholar himself. And as the saying is in English, that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So it's not surprising that Ibn Taymiyyah will become a great scholar of Islam, and both his father and his grandfather were righteous people and scholars of Islam. So his grandfather was a scholar, his father was also a scholar, and he turned out to be a scholar. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, he was born in the year 661 Hijriya, and he was born in a city called Harran. Harran is in modern day Turkey. And at that time, the geopolitics at that time was the Mongols were very strong and they're growing in number. And in English, you would call them the Mongols. In the Arabic, you would call them Tatar. And even in English, sometimes you call them the Tartar, which is a specific clan from the Mongols. And some say they're the Mongols who are the army of the Mongols, we call the Tatar. In any case, they were attacking Muslims, they were attacking everybody. They would come to a land and a city and they would destroy and wipe everything inside it, regardless of there's children, women, animals, trees, everything, they would burn it down. And Muslims at that time were really humiliated, really, really degraded and humiliated. It reached an extent, the scholars of history, they mention that a woman from the Tatar, she would come. She would be fighting in the army, and she would stand next to a Muslim man. And she would say to this Muslim man, stay here, I'm going to go, and then I'll come back and I'll tell you, don't move. And the man would stay. He would stay until the woman would go, come back with a sword, and then kill him. And he wouldn't move. That's how humiliated the Muslims were at that time. And the Mongols were really a force to be reckoned with, and nobody had really defeated the Mongols as such. And as we see, and we'll see soon inshallah ta'ala, Ibn Taymiyyah actually fights against the Mongol in a battle called Ma'arakat al-Shaqhab, and he actually wins the battle. And that's one of the first defeats, the scholars they say, of the Mongols. In any case, so Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, Allah protected him. They say at a young age he was very keen on knowledge. And as the Mongols were invading different lands, they were invading the land and the city of Harran where the Sheikh was born in and grew up in. And so at a young age, when he was very young, and some say at the age of 4 or 5 and 6, the Sheikh's father, they migrated from Harran to Damascus, Dimashq. So they packed their bags, and the account is mentioned in various books. And so the Sheikh, his father packed his bag and his grandfather packed his bags. They packed their books and they put it on the donkey and they left. And one of the students of Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah, his name was Ibn Abdul Hadi rahimahullah ta'ala. He died at a very young age, perhaps at the age of 36 or 39. I can't remember, but around in the 30s. And he wrote probably the best book on the life of Ibn Taymiyyah. It's called العقود الدرية في بعض مناقب شيخ الإسلام ابن تيمية. And he mentions in it, and he says, if it were not to be the righteousness of the father and the grandfather, the Mongols would have really captured Ibn Taymiyyah and his family, and today we would not have Ibn Taymiyyah. Really, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected this family. And the Mongols, they were catching everybody on the way, killing them instantly, on the spot. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed that this family of Ibn Taymiyyah, they made it safely to Damascus. When they made it to Damascus, his father being a sheikh and alim, he was teaching at a madrasa called Dar al-Hadith al-Sukariya. And Ibn Taymiyyah, he grew up in that environment where he sees his father teaching, and he's walking and reading and sometimes attending those lessons. So at a young age, he was exposed to knowledge. And again, another benefit that we take from this, if you have children, people have children, I don't know how old or young a lot of the brothers and sisters are, but if you have children, you raise them in an environment of knowledge, that they are encouraged to seek knowledge, they're encouraged to learn the Quran, the Arabic language, so they grow up to have those tendencies when they are much older. So the Sheikh, he grew up in that environment. A incident happens when he's at the age of 12. A Jewish man stops him in Damascus and he debates with him. And he's a man. This Jewish man is a grown man. And Ibn Taymiyyah is at the age of 12. And this goes back to the first point that I mentioned, which is Allah protected Ibn Taymiyyah even at a young age because of the righteousness of his father and his own righteousness. And Allah decreed it that way. And so the Jewish man came to debate this young boy and put doubts in the heart of Ibn Taymiyyah. And the story goes as follows, that Ibn Taymiyyah, he debated with the Jewish man for a number of days, and eventually the man accepted Islam. This is Ibn Taymiyyah at the age of what? 12. At the age of 12. And some of them, they mention that he, at one point, the Jewish man gave up. And Ibn Taymiyyah, he would say, I still have more to give you. I still have more arguments against you. And then the man ran away, and then he came back the following day. He accepted defeat and he accepted Islam eventually. So Ibn Taymiyyah was that kind of boy from a young age. And so I take another benefit from this is Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, during that period from 12 all the way up to 17, in 5 years of his life, he dedicated it for seeking knowledge. And we'll go through some of the things that he accomplished within knowledge. But in 5 years, at the age of 17, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala himself says, I have exhausted knowledge. What I can, I have exhausted it, in the sense I have become an expert in all of the sciences. Of course, knowledge has no end. And whoever claims they've reached the end of knowledge, they're not really a person of knowledge in reality. But he says, I've got a very good grasp on all of the main key sciences of the religion by the age of 17. And one of the first things that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala he embarked upon is memorizing the Quran. And this, again, my dear brothers and sisters, is another lesson, which is a student of knowledge should start with the Quran. And a person who does not start with the Quran later on regrets the fact that they hadn't started with the Quran. And some of the scholars, they say, Man dayya al-Quran, whoever lets loose of the Quran, meaning doesn't give it importance, فَلِسِوَاهُ أَضْيَعُ, then he's going to lose everything else. It's more foremost and more likely that he's not going to give attention to anything else. If a person cannot give attention to the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the Quran, then anything else is less important to him and is unlikely to gain that knowledge. And again, the Quran, it has a lot of virtues. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, even just reading it, man qara'a harfan min kitabillah, whoever reads a letter from the book of Allah. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, I don't say alif lam mim is harf, walakin alif harfun, alifun harfun, wa lamun harfun, wa mimun harf. So every letter you read in the Quran, you get 10 rewards. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, خيركم من تعلم القرآن وعلمه. The best of you are those who learn the Quran and they teach it to others. And the Quran is something that raises people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he raises people with this Quran, as Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, he mentioned. And so the Quran is something that a student of knowledge should take priority in as they begin their journey. On top of it, any Muslim in life, the Quran is light, huda, and it's nur, and it's guidance, it's everything. It's your lifeline in order to be saved in this dunya and in the akhirah. And so the Quran needs to be given its importance. And the Quran, you read it, you memorize it, you act upon it, and you reflect upon it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the Quran, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا, that a person should reflect upon the Quran. So the Quran is something that everybody should give importance to. And we see from the life of Ibn Taymiyyah, that's the first thing that he gave importance to, the Quran. Once he finished the Quran and he solidified the Quran, then he went on to the different sciences. He went on fiqh, he went to fiqh, he went to nahu, and they say he took nahu and he mastered nahu. He even took the book of Sibawayh, Uthman ibn Qambar. Sibawayh's book, Al-Kitab, as is referred to in the Arabic language, that's the name of the book. It's called the book, and Sibawayh is they call him the grandfather of the Arabic language, and he's the go-to when it comes to the Arabic language. And his book, even his book today, scholars of the Arabic language don't really digest his book like that, because it's a very high-level book. The most that they go to is the Alfiyat ibn Malik, and then they stop there and they take the shuruhat of it, but they don't go beyond that too much. So Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, he took the biggest book, which is Sibawayh's book, and he digested it, and he read it with thinking, with clarity, and he took it in. And he even, not only that, he started to point out some mistakes of Sibawayh in the Arabic language. And this is all, by the way, before the age of 17. He went to fiqh, and he started with the Hanbali madhab, of course, as it is the jadda, the seriousness of all the scholars of Islam. They start with a specific madhab, and then they eventually move on, and he eventually became a mujtahid mutlaq, an unrestricted person of independent reasoning. He took the different sciences, usul al-fiqh, he learned it, he became a master in a lot of the sciences, and all of this is before the age of 17, all of it. And at the age of 17, once he's experienced all of this, and he's gone through a lot, and he's learned through a lot, and he had a lot of teachers at this time, Ibn Abd al-Da'im and many others, he became well-grounded. And with that, he was still not teaching. He only started teaching when his father died at the age of 20. At the age of 20 is when he took his father's position in Darul Hadith al-Sukariya, and he was teaching. And imagine a Imam like Ibn Taymiyyah teaching at the age of 20, when there's great scholars around him at that time. Abu al-Hajjaj al-Mizzi, there's Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, and many others. They are living at that time. And you have the likes of a 20-year-old boy, Ibn Taymiyyah, sitting and teaching. And so you must have understand the amount of knowledge that he has, which stops us to another point of reflection, which is Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala was not born with knowledge in his mind. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَاللَّهُ أَخْرَجَكُم مِّن بُطُونِ أُمَّهَاتِكُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ شَيْئًا. Allah, He took you out from the wombs of your mother, not knowing anything. So me, you, and everybody listening, we all came out from the wombs of our mother, not having knowledge. Even Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, he didn't have knowledge when he was born. He had to acquire knowledge. So the difference between us and Ibn Taymiyyah is what? That he put in the effort. And a lot of us, we don't put in the effort, and we hope and we aim and we wish to achieve what these great scholars of Islam achieved. And sometimes we only see these scholars once they've become great scholars of Islam, not the work when they were young, or not the starting point and the beginning point of these scholars. He must have found knowledge hard. He must have struggled in knowledge. He must have had times where memorizing was hard. He had those moments. We don't see them, but he had those moments. So just because you're on a journey to seeking knowledge, to learning about Islam, to practicing Islam, and you find it hard, don't just give up. Everybody has difficult moments, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He aids a Muslim bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So at the age of 20, he started to teach. And Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, he taught in Dar al-Hadith al-Sukariya, and he took a lot of other positions as well. From it, he would give tafsir on Jami' al-Umawi. His father, he used to also do teaching and tafsir. And they say his father used to teach without a book, بغير قراطيس, without any scrolls and books in front of him. He would teach from memory. Ibn Taymiyyah, when he would sit to do the tafsir of the Quran in Jami' al-Umawi in Damascus, he would sit and he would say to the people, and this would be generally after Fajr, and he would say to the people, bring me an ayah, or mention an ayah, read an ayah. And from the crowd, somebody would mention an ayah. And they say Ibn Taymiyyah would close his eyes, and he would open his eyes, and he would do tafsir of the ayah from memory. All of this from memory. And he would sometimes say about himself, إِنِّي رُبَّمَا أَنظُرُ فِي تَفْسِيرِ آيَةٍ وَاحِدَةٍ. I would perhaps look and read for the tafsir of one ayah, 100 books of tafsir. For one ayah, he would go through 100 books of tafsir to understand the meaning of the ayah. And also he took the position of the Madrasa al-Hanabila over there, where he was teaching as well at the same time. And Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, he went vast in knowledge. He taught a lot, and he stuck to the athari position when it comes to Aqidah, and his books are quite famous. You have the likes of his book, Al-Aqidah al-Wasatiyya, Al-Hamawiyya, Al-Tadmuriyya. These are all books of Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, and they were books written as responses to questions that arrived to him from different places. Al-Wasatiyya was a letter or a question that was posed to him by Al-Qadi Radiyuddin al-Wasati from Wasat. So it's called Al-Wasatiyya for that reason. Al-Hamawiyya came from Hama. That's why it's called Al-Hamawiyya. Tadmuriyya came from a place called Tadmur. It's called the Tadmuriyya. So there were questions. So people would ask him for fatawa and he would respond. And one of the things that's also amazing about some of these books, for example, Al-Wasatiyya and Al-Hamawiyya, which sometimes people take a long time to explain. For example, the Islamic universities sometimes teach the contents of Al-Hamawiyya and Al-Wasatiyya over a span of 1 year. Of course, they have other things they teach in the middle, but that book, they take a long time to teach that book. And some of the scholars today even, they've taken 2 years to teach some of these books. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala wrote this book between Dhuhr and Asr. In the time between Dhuhr and Asr, he responded to that and he gave him the letter and he took the answer back with him. So it's amazing how Allah placed so much barakah in the life of this man that something he wrote between Dhuhr and Asr takes people around 1 year, maybe even like minimum 6 months to study it and teach it. So rahimahullah ta'ala, he was vast in knowledge. He was very quick when it came to writing down. His speed of writing down, they say, he was able to write down what a katib, a person that day, on that time, who had the official position of writing. And there were people who were kuttab. Their only job, and this was a profession they had, is writing down and copying. Back in the day, they didn't have the photocopy and press, etc. So for them to write a book, you need to take the book to them. They'll have blank papers and they will write it down for you. It's a job they had. And these people were professionals. And they say Ibn Taymiyyah was faster than a katib. He was faster than these professionals who were writing. His speed of writing was faster than theirs. And he could able to write what a person would write in weeks, he could write it in 1 day. With that being said, Ibn Taymiyyah's handwriting wasn't the best, which poses a lot of difficulty for those who came after him. So for example, sometimes Ibn Taymiyyah would write. When he finished writing, he would look down and he couldn't recognize what he wrote himself. And there was a man, especially from his students, Ibn Rushayq. His job was to read the handwriting of Ibn Taymiyyah. And he was the expert in reading Ibn Taymiyyah's handwriting. And also, even today's scholars, when they find manuscripts of the book of Ibn Taymiyyah, they find it hard to read. And some of these mashayikh, for example, Sheikh al-Allama, Sheikh Uzair Shams, rahimahullah ta'ala, he would say sometimes it takes him hours to read one line or one word just to understand what Ibn Taymiyyah has written. And it takes a lot of practice. So the Sheikh rahimahullah ta'ala was very fast when he used to write. At the same time, his memory was vast. He had a lot of memory. And he memorized a lot. And he says, there is no deviated sect of Islam except I know their roots, I know where they came from, and I know their arguments. So he knew the furuq of the different sects of Islam really deeply. And the Shaykh rahimahullah ta'ala, to show you his vast knowledge, one time when he was young, some say around the age of 14 and some say 13, the Shaykh's family, they wanted to go out to a nuzha, just to go and enjoy themselves and sightseeing and relax and have some family time. And the Shaykh was adamant, I don't want to leave my house. I just want to stay in the house. They said, come. He said, no, I just want to stay in the house. So when the Shaykh's family left, they probably went for a few hours and they came back. One of his family members, they said, what did you achieve in this time? Wasn't it better that you would have come out with us and enjoyed with us in the family? He said, no, I achieved quite a lot. And they said, what did you achieve? He said, I memorized the kitab, Rawdatu al-Anwar, Rawdatu al-Nadhir wa Junnat al-Manadhir. Rawdatu al-Nadhir wa Junnat al-Manadhir by Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi rahimahullah ta'ala. It's a book on Usul al-Fiqh, it's 4 volumes. Today I have it, it's 4 volumes. He memorized it at that age. He said, I finished memorizing it in a few hours that you guys were away. And that's a book of Usul al-Fiqh that people hardly read today, let alone memorize. So he memorized it at that young age. And for those who know hadith, when he started to go on his journey of hadith, as us today in the modern day, we study small books of hadith. We start with a book called Al-Arba'un al-Nawiyya. We memorize a book of collection of 42 hadith, small book. Then you go to a bit of a bigger book, Umdatul Ahkam. Then you go to Bulugh al-Maram. Then you go up and up and up and up. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala's first book that he memorized was neither of these or none of these. He memorized the book Al-Jam'u Bayn al-Sahihayn, where it's hadith of Bukhari and Muslim compiled together. Even that I believe is around 3 volumes or 5 volumes today by Al-Humaydi. So he memorized that as his beginner book. So he's a person who had a lot of knowledge in his mind and his heart. And to give you an understanding, at a time where there was a time in his life where the Mongols were going to attack Damascus. They had attacked his hometown, as we mentioned, Harran. They were now going to come and attack Damascus. And the Sheikh, he wanted the help of other Muslims. So he took a riding beast, a horse, and he traveled from Damascus to Egypt without any breaks. And back in those days, you would have what is known as a barid. Barid is a fast-moving horse. And they were stationed at different points between cities. And they were used to convey important messages from one city to another city. He got onto the barid, and he moved from one horse to the next horse, left the first horse, got onto the second one, moved on to the next horse, left the second horse, got onto the third horse, etc. Until he made it to Egypt. He went straight into the house of the ruler at that time. And at that time, in the majlis of the ruler in Egypt was a man called Ibn Daqiq al-Eid. Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, he was a scholar of Islam from the Shafi'i Madhab, a great scholar of Islam. And Ibn Daqiq al-Eid was sitting, and he was at that point appointed as what is known as Qadi Qudat. He was the judge, or the biggest judge in that time. And he's considered to be what we would call today the Ministry of Justice. That's him, Ibn Daqiq al-Eid. And Ibn Daqiq al-Eid is sitting there. Ibn Taymiyyah walks in and he starts to speak to the ruler, who is a Muslim, encouraging him and reading the ayat of jihad at that time from his memory, the hadith, and encouraging him to send support to protect Damascus. And then eventually the ruler he did. And Ibn Daqiq, he was asked about Ibn Taymiyyah. He said, I only met him that one time. And when I met him, رَأَيْتُ رَجُلًا, I saw a man. كُلَّ الْعُلُومِ بَيْنَ عَيْنَيْهِ, all of the knowledge is between his two eyes. يَأْخُذُ مَا يُرِيد وَيَدَعُ مَا يُرِيد. He takes what he wishes and he leaves what he wishes. It's like Ibn Taymiyyah had knowledge presented all in front of him, and he could pick and choose what he wants. That shows you the vast memorization and knowledge this man had. And a funny incident as well, he was asked as well, why didn't you speak to Ibn Taymiyyah? He said, رَأَيْتُ رَجُلًا يُحِبُّ الْكَلَامِ وَأَنَا أُحِبُّ السُّكُوتِ. I saw a man, he likes to speak and I like to stay silent, so I never spoke to him. But I saw him in that gathering. And by the way, the jihad at that time was a valid jihad with conditions, and therefore he was encouraging the people to go and help the Muslims at that time. So the point is, he had vast knowledge, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, he was a person who engaged in refuting the different sects within Islam. And not only that, he refuted the sects outside Islam, like the Jews and the Christians and the fire worshippers. And he even didn't leave anybody alone who was on a false ideology, except he refuted them. For example, he has a kitab called Ar-Rad ala al-Mantiqiyin, the response to the people or the logicians, those who use mantiq, logic. And he responded to them. And he used logic in order to respond to them. So he responded to them and refuted them in their own way, in their own language. And so Ibn Taymiyyah was that kind of man where he stopped and refuted everyone. And again, he did this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And something that shows you the vast knowledge of this man and the fact that he was doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is 2 incidents. One is a man called Ibn Zamlakani or Zamlakani. Zamlakani. This man, Zamlakani, was one of the staunchest enemies of Ibn Taymiyyah. He speaks about Ibn Taymiyyah and he says, Ibn Taymiyyah was a man who all of knowledge was with him. And if he ever spoke about a topic, you would think this topic is his field. He's an expert in this, meaning he's a person who's learned this topic, he knows this topic, and he doesn't know anything else. That's how much knowledge he had. And he himself said, I don't think I have seen anyone like Ibn Taymiyyah in knowledge. And this is his enemy. Neither do I think Ibn Taymiyyah himself has seen anyone like himself. So his own enemy is praising him about his knowledge. Also, another incident that shows you that he was a person who was sincere is Ibn Makhluf al-Maliki was a man who was a very staunch enemy of Ibn Taymiyyah. To an extent, he was perhaps the staunchest of his enemies. He once even said to the people, he said, "Uqtul Ibn Taymiyyah, kill Ibn Taymiyyah, wa damuhu ala unuqi." He gave a fatwa for the people to go and kill Ibn Taymiyyah, and he said that his blood is on my neck. If Allah asks me on the Day of Judgment, why did people kill Ibn Taymiyyah? I will stand up and I will take your responsibility. So this man, when he died, and Qaddar Allah, he died before Ibn Taymiyyah died. And he died when Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala was in prison. And so they came and they said, and some of his students, they said, we give you news and glad tidings. He said, what? They said, your student or your enemy, Ibn Makhluf al-Maliki, he's died. He got very angry. He said, Atubashiruni, are you giving me glad tidings of the death of a Muslim man? And he got very upset of these people. And some say he wasn't in prison, but he was in his house. So he left and he went out to the family of Ibn Makhluf al-Maliki, and he said to them, he knocked on his door, and the wife opened up with the children there, and he said to his wife, anything you need from today onwards, I am like in the position of the father for these children. Any support, any financial things, come to me. Look at this. This is his staunchest enemy. So even this aspect of Ibn Taymiyyah always amazes me. How can he be a man where people are killing him, imprisoning him, and he's just not holding any grudges in his heart? Rahimahullah ta'ala. Ibn Taymiyyah, as it's known, he was imprisoned many times for a lot of the beliefs that he held, and he was not calling to anything except the Quran and the Sunnah, and upon the understanding of the Salaf, and that's what he called to, nothing else. With that, he had a lot of enemies from the different sects of Islam, and so he was imprisoned several times in the prison of Al-Qal'a. Is a famous prison in Damascus where he was imprisoned, rahimahullah ta'ala. And ironically, Sheikh al-Albani, rahimahullah ta'ala, was also imprisoned in the same prison later on, many years later on. So Ibn Taymiyyah was imprisoned, and that did not stop him from seeking knowledge. He would take his pens, and a lot of the writings he did was whilst he was in prison. And his prison is not like prison that we think of today. And yes, it was bad. It was a dungeon. It was dark. It was not a nice environment, but he had a bit of freedom. He was able to read and write, etc. So a lot of the books that he wrote, responses he wrote, he was in prison. For example, the Jawab I'tiradat al-Misriya, he wrote it in prison. He wrote a refutation against a man who tried to refute his book Al-Hamawiyya. We don't really have the entire book, but we have a section of the Jawab I'tiradat, not all of it. But in any case, he was writing whilst he was in prison. A lot of the books he wrote, he was in prison. And it reached an extent where the people didn't like him writing in prison, so they took his pens and papers away eventually as well. But the rahimahullah ta'ala was that kind of a man, rahimahullah. Nothing stopped him from seeking knowledge and benefiting the people. And there's a funny incident, or a very smart incident that shows you the cleverness of Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah, one time, he was debating a group of people from the Sufiya. And these people from the Sufi ideology, they used to believe in a way, the veneration of who they call the awliya. And again, we respect awliya as well. We believe in the concept of awliya, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ. Yes, a person who has iman and taqwa, he's a person who's a wali of Allah, no doubt about it. But they would sometimes look at people and they would say, this person is a righteous person, so you cannot say anything to him. And they would go overboard in this. They would say, look, we are righteous people of Allah, so the fire doesn't burn us. So they would walk into fire and they would come out, nothing would happen to them, unburnt. Ibn Taymiyyah said, no problem. If you're a wali of Allah, and you think your religion is upon the truth, or your sect of Islam is upon the truth, after he debated with them for a long time, he said, no problem. Let's both go into the fire and see who comes out safe. But with one condition. Let's put vinegar on our skin and wash ourselves with vinegar, or I think he said vinegar, and then we both go inside. The reason he said this, because this deviated sect of the Sufiya, they would put a oil on their body which prevented the skin or the fire from burning them. So he knew this. So he said, let's both wash ourselves with vinegar and then we both go in. And they refused. And therefore, as a result, they lost the debate, and their matter was exposed to the rest of the people who were watching. So he was very sharp and clever as well. He was also very brave. He partook in a lot of the battles at his time. As we mentioned, he partook in the battle called Sheikh against the Mongols. Prior to him partaking the night before it, he was seen making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all night, and begging Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for victory. And he had built up the people with knowledge first before he engaged and took them to battle. He had built these people up with a lot of knowledge. And rahimahullah ta'ala, the night before, he was making dua, and then he stopped at a point where it's Fajr time, and he said to the people, we are going to be victorious. So the people looked at him and they said, say inshallah, Sheikh. Yes, we're victorious, but say inshallah if Allah wills. And then he said something, and he said, inshallah, tahqiqan la ta'liqan. I'm saying inshallah, but this is conviction. And this is not the sort of inshallah where you say inshallah, but you're not very certain about. No, he says, this is tahqiqan, with certainty. I'm only saying it with certainty. I know Allah is going to give me victory. And then he went into battle, and they actually won the battle, the Muslims, and defeated and kept the Mongols away from Damascus at that time, rahimahullah ta'ala. So he was a very brave man, and even the account that Ibn Abdul Hadi he mentions in the battle is Ibn Taymiyyah, who would look for the side where the enemy was the most, and he would charge into it, fearless, and would fight until he would come out himself, rahimahullah ta'ala. So he's a man who's very brave. Another incident that shows you the bravery of this man, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, is that Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, one time he was in front of a king of the Mongols. And the Mongols, a certain group of them, they used to believe and they used to pretend to be Muslims. And they had a lot of issues, but they also pretend to be Muslim at the same times. And so Ibn Taymiyyah, he got fed up with the king at that time. He went and he advised him in public in front of him. And he started to give him advice, and he said things that are harsh to him. And he said, your forefathers were better than you. At least they were following Islam better than you. You claim to follow Islam and you don't do this. So he was advising him, and he was very harsh. He was very harsh with him. To an extent, some of the students of Ibn Taymiyyah were right next to him. And they said, we covered our faces with our garments. We were just waiting for the king to now slash the head of Ibn Taymiyyah, to give the command to cut his head, slash it. And Ibn Taymiyyah is going to die. We just didn't want the blood to go on our faces, so we covered our faces with the garment. We were that scared of this king. And Ibn Taymiyyah was fearless. He would speak the truth, and nothing would stop him from speaking the truth. So rahimahullah ta'ala, he's a very brave man as well. To wrap up, inshallah ta'ala, I know we don't have too much time, and I don't want it to go too long. And this man, like I said, his life is something that a person should look into very, very deeply. But rahimahullah ta'ala, he produced a lot of students as well. And perhaps a lot of these names of his students, a lot of us are familiar with. From his student, and one of his greatest students is Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala. Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who is known as the doctor of the hearts. He's written many books. He is a student of Ibn Taymiyyah. And Sheikh Abdul Razak al-Afifi rahimahullah ta'ala, who's a Sheikh from Egypt. He came and he lived in Saudi Arabia and became a scholar. He mentioned something about the way Ibn Taymiyyah was and the way that Ibn al-Qayyim was. He said, Ibn Taymiyyah يأتي إلى جدار الباطل. Ibn Taymiyyah, he would come to the wall of falsehood and he would destroy it from its roots. He would break it down from the foundations. And that's how Ibn Taymiyyah was. When he used to debate people and all of the arguments that he would have, he would he'd come from an angle that you cannot return back from. He would destroy your premise in the first place, rahimahullah ta'ala. And he would say, Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala, on the other hand, يأتي إلى جدار الباطل, and he would take it ينقضها لبنا لبنا. He would take each brick of this one by one. So he would take the first brick off, he would take the second brick off, third brick off. That's how he would do it. This is how Ibn al-Qayyim was. In his refutations and in his responses, he would say, this argument, I'm going to respond to it from 120 angles. And number one, number two, number three, he would list it down. This argument, I will respond to it from 240 ways. And would respond to it 240 ways. Rahimahullah ta'ala. So Ibn al-Qayyim, he was one of the students of Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala. Imam al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah ta'ala, was also his student. This great man, muhaddith, mu'arrikh, mufassir, not mufassir, afwan, but muhaddith and mu'arrikh. He was the student of Ibn Taymiyyah. He was asked to describe Ibn Taymiyyah. And he said, time does not allow me to describe Ibn Taymiyyah. And time is too short for me to describe Ibn Taymiyyah. He's more than what I can describe him of. Ibn Abdul Hadi, as we mentioned, is one of his students, and he wrote perhaps the biggest and the best book on the life of Ibn Taymiyyah, as I mentioned, Al-Uqud al-Durriya fi Ba'd Manaqib Sheikh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. It's around one volume, but I think it's around 500 pages. And Ibn Abdul Hadi himself was a very knowledgeable person. And the scholars, they generally say, for you to know this person is knowledgeable, you know it from three ways. Number one, from the other scholars that praise him. Number two, from the books he produces. And number three, from the students he produces. If Ibn Taymiyyah only produced the first three students, Al-Dhahabi, Ibn al-Qayyim, and Ibn Abdul Hadi, it would have been sufficient. Even if he only produced Ibn al-Qayyim, that would have been sufficient to say Ibn Taymiyyah himself is a scholar of Islam. But let alone the rest of the scholars. And Ibn Abdul Hadi himself is a great scholar of Islam. He's an imam in hadith, and he wrote the Kitab al-Sarim al-Munki fi Raddi ala al-Subki, responded to Taqiyuddin al-Subki and the issue of Shadd al-Rihal. So he's a great imam. And some of the scholars, they said, if Ibn Abdul Hadi, Muhammad ibn Abdul Hadi al-Maqdisi, if he lived, he would have come with ajaib, fascination. Also from his students is Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir, the tafsir of Ibn Kathir, the great mufassir, he's actually a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala. The likes of Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, he's a student of Ibn Taymiyyah. And many other scholars are students of Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala, like Ibn Muflih, who belongs to the great family of al-Muflih, Jamaluddin al-Mizzi, Alamuddin al-Barzari, and many other scholars. They are students of Ibn Taymiyyah. They took from Ibn Taymiyyah. So you understand the value of this man, Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala. And he wrote many great books, and scholars praised him. If you want to understand what kind of a scholar Ibn Taymiyyah is, go to the book الرد الوافر على من زعم أن شيخ الإسلام ابن تيمية كافر by Ibn Nasir al-Din al-Dimishqi. Ibn Nasir al-Din al-Dimishqi, he wrote a kitab defending Ibn Taymiyyah against those who claimed Ibn Taymiyyah as a disbeliever. And in the beginning of the book, he lays down the conditions of who is going to be called a Sheikh al-Islam, or the definition of the name Sheikh al-Islam. Who is entitled to this title? Who deserves this title? If you read that, you'll be fascinated. And only people who reach the pinnacle of knowledge would be called Sheikh al-Islam. And within our religion, if we ever say Sheikh al-Islam unrestrictedly, and that's it, it always goes to Ibn Taymiyyah. It shows you the knowledge of this great man, Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala. I'll try to wrap up bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. There are a few books that I would recommend if you want to learn about the life of Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala. In English, there is a good resource written by a professor called John Hoover. John Hoover is a professor in Nottingham University, and his only research topic is Ibn Taymiyyah, and he's not even a Muslim. But he wrote a very good book about the life of Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala. It's also translated into Arabic, but it's a good book in English to go back to. Book by John Hoover, the professor in Nottingham University. In Arabic, there's plenty of books. Like I said, perhaps the best book written about his life is by his own student, Ibn Abdul Hadi, rahimahullah ta'ala. There's also a book written by Sheikh Abdullah ibn Abdul Rahman ibn al-Barrak, rahimahullah ta'ala. It's called Al-Manthur fi Sirati Sheikh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah. Al-Manthur fi Sirati Sheikh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah. It's a small book, It's only 98 pages. It's very small. There is a book that is bigger than that. It's called Al-Jami' لسيرة Sheikh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah خلال 7 قرون. It's a compilation of the life of Ibn Taymiyyah over 7 centuries. Over 7 centuries. So it's written about his life, and all of the books that were written in those will compile together. So all the books about the life of Ibn Taymiyyah will compile together and put together. And this was written by Sheikh Muhammad Uzair Shams rahimahullah ta'ala and Sheikh Ali Imrani hafidhahullah ta'ala, and it's around 817 pages. And there's many other books that you can read. Imam al-Dhahabi has a book on his life, and many other scholars, even the Tabaqat of the Hanabila, they write about Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept it from us and to have mercy upon this great Sheikh of Islam, Sheikh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, and hopefully we've been motivated somehow, even if it's a little extent, in order to achieve what this great man achieved in Islam. And ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy upon us and have mercy upon the Sheikh rahimahullah ta'ala. And if there's any questions, then inshallah we'll take them. And if not, we'll stop. Barakallahu feekum. Wa jazakumullahu khairan. Are there any questions? Okay, I think the brother's gone, inshallah, to pray. And I think there is no more questions. Barakallahu feekum. And we'll stop here. Subhanaka Allahumma bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruhu wa atubu ilayh. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullahu khairan.